Right now, let's dial in Fox News senior judicial analyst Andrew Napolitano. Well, let's talk a little bit about what Kelly was just referring to. The Saudi national is apparently in custody in the hospital, has some burns on him. He's not being called a suspect, but perhaps he's a person of interest, could be on the student visa.
Well, there must be enough evidence to keep him there. I mean, he is in custody. He's not free to leave. He's not in a jail.
And it sounds like they searched his house last night.
Yes, they searched his house last night pursuant to a search warrant issued by a federal judge based upon whatever they knew about him and whatever he told them. So they must be learning information, which is of a suspicious nature.
Can I stop you 1 second? Judge, if he was clearly innocent, would they have been able to search his house? Well, if nothing was leading to any other reason, if he gave the right answer, said I was just standing there, would they have searched his house?
Honestly, I think almost any judge would give them almost any search warrant they want in those circumstances, as long as there's something. We saw him running away, and his pattern.
But the bomb had just gone off.
Right. Anybody would run from the bomb. He appeared different from everybody else. He appeared deceitful. He appeared more concerned than
But how much
anybody
of that?
else.
I mean, how much of that is? It's a guy from Saudi Arabia. He doesn't necessarily look like the other guys there. We've been trained to sort of do some racial profiling. I mean, and how much of that can be attributed, you know, the suspicion on him to that versus we have real reason to believe this guy committed a terror attack?
Theoretically, judges are not supposed to take that into account. But in the moments after this happened, when there is a burning, compelling governmental interest to gather evidence against someone who might be involved, almost any judge would sign that kind of a search warrant. Now they have all kinds of experts going through everything that's in there. What's in his computer? What's in his cell phone? What's in his visa application? Who are his connections back in Saudi Arabia? They can't develop that information overnight, but they can do it pretty quickly.
Sure.
Was he honest or was he deceptive when he made his visa application, which is a lot more complex post 9/11, but which any smart and determined person can trick the government and get in here even though they have evil designs. Was he a real student or was this just a front?
Right, and Boston is a college town. There are a lot of students on visas from many different countries there.
Yes.
But you said he might be able to trick, you know, the immigration service to give him the visa. How?
Well,
just flat out lie?
I don't want to be critical of the government here because this is a crisis moment. The government simply lacks the resources to check and monitor the movement in a foreign country and here of every foreign student that comes here. So if he determined before he signed up for the visa, I'm going to go to Boston, I'm going to pretend to be a student, I'm going to trick my way in, and once I'm there, I'm going to kill people. He probably could have gotten away with it, or at least gotten to the point where he perpetrated his murderous deeds.
What's the story on his ability to lawyer up? Because there's been a lot of debate about whether we should be treating alleged terrorist suspects, and he's just being called a person of interest right now, as if they're in the criminal justice system or as if they're potential terrorists.
Right now he has the same constitutional protections as any one of the four of us would if the police were interrogating us. And theoretically...
So if he is in custody, even though he's in the hospital,
yes,
he gets a lawyer.
Theoretically, the first thing they said to him was, you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to a lawyer. If you can't afford one, we will get you a lawyer who will be loyal to you, and he'll be here in 5 minutes.
All right, and then the lawyer shows up, and then he says, shut up.
Apparently that's not what happened. Again, we don't know, but the word we're getting is...
There are a lot of stories out there.
He is speaking.
All right, Judge Napolitano, thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, well, we thought we were close. Apparently no suspect at hand or one arrested. They might be close, or they might have arrested somebody, but certainly they're not saying it right now. But that does raise the issue. Who do they arrest? Who would it be? Judge Napolitano here, it really does depend on that person and the nationality of that person. Judge, explain, because that could decide where that suspect goes.
It wouldn't depend on their nationality. It would depend on their affiliation. Because a person affiliated with and under the control of a paramilitary organization with foreign roots would be a candidate for a dispatch to Guantanamo Bay.
So just being Saudi Arabian, let's say, doesn't necessarily mean...
Oh, no, absolutely not. To the contrary. If whoever this person is will initially receive the full panoply of constitutional protections that any American would. Why? Because the Constitution protects persons. It doesn't limit its protection to Americans. If the President of the United States determines that this was a military or military-like operation directed by a foreign power, either a foreign government or Al-Qaeda or something like that, as Wayne Simmons just suggested to you, The president would have the option under Bush-era legislation to send that person to Guantanamo Bay for a military tribunal. If that is not the case, and most respectfully, it appears that that is not the case thus far, then that person would go through the same unremarkable, ordinary, routine criminal justice procedures that anybody would in the federal courts in the United States of America.
All right, so for an American, it would be the American courts.
Even a foreigner not controlled by a foreign paramilitary organization.
But wouldn't
it would be
we
American
more
courts.
than likely attach to a foreigner, particularly a Muslim, just calling a spade here, other affiliations, even if at first blush they're not there?
Here's why I don't think that would happen. First, that decision would be made by the Attorney General personally after consulting with the President. President Obama has sent 0 people to Guantanamo Bay since he's been President of the United States, perhaps because of his personal objection to Guantanamo Bay, perhaps because of this. The military has tried 3 people in Gitmo since 9/11. All 3 were convicted. All 3 were released after conviction for time served. The federal courts have tried over 51 people. All 51 were convicted. All 51 were sentenced to jail terms from between 20 years to life in prison. The federal courts are far more efficient, again, most respectfully to my colleagues in the military justice system, far more efficient than the military tribunals in Guantanamo Bay.
I just have a feeling if it's someone affiliated with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, what have you, it risks being a farce. That's my fear, that the judicial process
You know, that
could be farcical.
That is a fear that animated the drafters of legislation in the George W. Bush administration, which is why we have this option for the president. But for those 51 cases that were tried here, and a lot of them were low-level people, though some of them did get life sentences, the farce did not happen. The trials were real. Many of these were guilty pleas.
All right.
If he is charged, or she is charged, or they are charged with a capital crime, they can only be sentenced to death by a jury. They cannot be sentenced to death by a judge. So if they plead guilty, they still have to have a trial on what the punishment should be, execution or life in prison, because only a jury can impose execution.
And that's leaving aside the possibility of co-conspirators and lots of people coming.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Judge, thank you very, very much.
Well, Senator Lindsey Graham has been very outspoken on how the younger suspect ought to be handled by authorities. Here's Senator Graham.
2 things should happen. When the public safety exception expires, and it will here soon, this man, in my view, should be designated as a potential enemy combatant, and we should be allowed to question him for intelligence gathering purposes to find out about future attacks and terrorist organizations that may exist.
There's a part of me that really wants to agree with the senator. He is my friend, and I like him a lot. But if he's asking us to sort of suspend all of our understanding of the due process of law that has established us as a unique light among the darkness in this world, then I've got to think through that very carefully. Yes, I want to be able to question these guys. No, I don't want them to get all lawyered up. But at the same time, we are a country of laws. I do want our country to acknowledge terrorism when it's obvious terrorism. For example, I want us to say Fort Hood, that was terrorism. I want us to say Little Rock, the shooting of the soldier outside the recruiting office. Let's be honest, let's say that's terrorism. But the question is, do we suspend the normal due processes of law, whether it's to these guys or to you or to me, and to designate somebody as an enemy combatant? That is a tougher one. In fact, it's tough enough that probably the smart thing to do is to bring Judge Andrew Napolitano on board. I know he's got his view of Senator Lindsey Graham's comments, and I welcome Judge Napolitano, Senior Judicial Analyst for Fox News. Judge, this is a tough one. Help us work through this in terms of, do we designate this guy enemy combatant or treat him through the criminal justice system?
Well, first, good evening, Governor. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thanks for having me. Senator Graham is well known to many of us at Fox. He's also a friend of mine, and no one can question his motivation. But we'll start with a couple of basics. The first is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. How do we know that? It says it in the Constitution. The second is everybody who works for the government You did this when you were the governor of Arkansas. I did this when I was a Superior Court judge in New Jersey. Senator Graham did this when he became a U.S. Senator, took an oath to uphold the Constitution. That means upholding it when it pinches as well as when it comforts. The proper procedure here is to prosecute the surviving of the two brothers in the federal district court, probably not in Boston. I don't know how we could get a fair trial in Boston, but in some federal district court somewhere that has jurisdiction over these crimes. Remember, Tim McVeigh, who was convicted of blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma City, was actually prosecuted in Denver. I would think that this defendant would have to be prosecuted somewhere else. But there's no basis here whatsoever to believe or to suggest that we should suspend the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't have a provision for its suspension. In fact, when presidents have done this, when FDR did it, when Lincoln did it during the Civil War, and the Supreme Court reviewed their suspension of the Constitution, it always shot them down. It always said, the Constitution exists for good times and bad, for monsters and for innocents, for the governed and for those doing the governing. And there's no provision to suspend it, period.
Well, and I think that's the point at which so many of us, again, uncomfortably come, is that, yeah, this guy's a monster. We all want him to pay the ultimate price for what he did in Boston. But if the justice system does not work for the worst, for the most hideous among us,
right,
then there may come that day, Judge, when it doesn't work for the best among us either. And it is what separates us from the other nations of the world that often use their government as a source of revenge and vengeance rather than a source of justice. Help us to understand the difference between justice and vengeance.
Well, I mean, justice is giving a person their desert, what they are due by virtue of what they did. Justice in America, justice in the Western world, cannot be meted out by politicians or by mobs in the streets or by police in a backyard when someone's hiding in a boat. Justice can only be meted about in a calm, deliberative sense in a courtroom with a jury of 12 people, with a neutral judge, neutral jurors, with the government presenting its case and defense challenging it. That's the system. Look, we have that system here because the kings of England didn't always give justice to the colonists, and we fought a revolution and wrote a constitution to assure that the federal government here and the states here could not treat us without justice, could not punish us without a jury trial, to interrogate him and not advise him of his right to remain silent, to take him to Guantanamo Bay, to treat him as if he were a soldier out of uniform from a foreign government sent here to kill Americans, would clearly not be just and is nowhere authorized under the law. You see, the rule of law requires that the law exist before the crime and that the law be followed when you're prosecuting this person as it existed at the time of the crime. There's no provision for the President of the United States to take this guy, as horrendous as we believe he is, and as profound as is the evidence of his guilt, away from the criminal justice system and ship him to Guantanamo Bay. I'll make Senator Graham's argument for him. If this guy's really a soldier from a foreign country who put civilian clothing on, who was financed and trained and paid for and sent here by a foreign government that wants to destroy the United States of America, then he can be treated as a soldier of a foreign country. Then he can be treated as an enemy combatant. But Governor, there's not an iota of evidence to support that. In fact, the statements that the FBI has made are to the contrary. Mayor Menino, Governor Patrick, the head of the FBI in Boston have all said these guys were not sent by a foreign government.
And I think you make a great point, too, about the just desert that people sometimes get. Timothy McVeigh is a great example, who was prosecuted under criminal law, ultimately executed. But we have a sense of justice having been accomplished. Judge, please stay with us. We've got more that we want to talk about, including, did the bombing suspect's older brother lure him to participate in this week's attacks? And could that hurt our chances for his conviction? We'll be back with the judge in just a moment. Well, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has been portrayed as a nice guy, somebody who would never hurt a fly, even a follower of his demanding older brother. So is he being portrayed as a victim before he even gets to trial? We're back with Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, do you expect that the defense is going to try to say, really wasn't his fault? He was just a kid, his brother duped him into it. And is that going to be effective given the heinous nature of the crime?
Well, I do expect the defense would say it, Mike. It's actually called a defense of diminished capacity, a fancy phrase meaning, yeah, he did this stuff, but he wasn't of a clear mind when he did it. He was led along by somebody else. Somebody else was actually controlling his will, not in a zombie-like way, but just because of his relationship to his brother. Will it work? You know, it's going to depend on the jury. If it does work, Governor, it would save him from execution. He still could be convicted of some lesser offense than use of a weapon of mass destruction to kill people, but he'd go to jail for the rest of his life rather than be executed.
I can only imagine the outrage in this country if this guy were to get anything less than a death sentence for what he did. And does it matter that in the hours following this vicious attack, he went to work out at the fitness center, slept in his dorm, he tweeted and connected with social media? Does that not kind of indicate this guy's really just cold-blooded?
You know, it actually cuts both ways, Governor. Sometimes the absence of remorse shows that you really didn't think you did anything wrong. Other times, the absence of remorse shows that you're just a cold-blooded killer who has no feeling whatsoever for the horrific crime just committed. It's going to depend upon how that absence of remorse is portrayed by his defense lawyers and then resisted by the government's lawyers. Here's an interesting law for you. He does not have to prove diminished capacity. The government has to prove that he had full capacity, that he was not diminished. The burden is always on the government in this type of case.
Do you think this trial will be one that we'll see televised when it ever comes about?
No. In fact, we know it won't be televised because it'll be in a federal court, as I said earlier, probably not in Boston. And federal courts are not, and cameras, even still cameras, much less television cameras, are not permitted in federal courts. We'll have a good idea of what's happening, but we're not going to be able to watch it in real time.
If you were sitting on the bench in this case where before you, what would be the concerns that you would have to make sure that the trial was fair and yet at the same time that it didn't turn into a sideshow and a circus of ranting and raving some terrorist nonsense?
Well, the judge's job is the gatekeeper, so the judge doesn't decide what the evidence is, doesn't decide what the evidence means, but he decides what evidence, or she decides what evidence the jury will hear. I'd have a couple of concerns. Did the government follow proper procedures? Did the FBI follow the Constitution and federal law in the manner in which it gathered evidence against him? My other concern would be, this is just going to be a trial on whether or not he did these acts and intended to do them and intended fully and knowingly to do them. This is not going to be a trial on American foreign policy or on religion or on Muslim versus Judeo-Christian, because that's not a defense, and therefore there's no place for that in the courtroom.
Judge, you've just given us some of the reasons that we're so very glad that we asked you to be here tonight. Thank you for joining us on this special live broadcast. Great to talk with you always.
Pleasure, Governor. Thanks.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, senior judicial analyst for Fox News.
According to court papers filed today, the bombing suspects delivered a chilling message to the man they carjacked on Thursday saying, "Did you hear about the Boston explosion? I did that." Let's take this to the judge, Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Shep.
I remember producers and I were talking about how this sort of thing has happened repeatedly lately, thankfully. Remember the suspect in California, the cop who was going around killing cops?
Right.
He let a man live, and that man led to his demise. In this case, he let the carjacking victim live, and arguably that led to his demise as well.
Yeah, the statement that you just quoted, which is exceptionally chilling, comes from a 10-page affidavit signed by an FBI agent. The FBI agent relates in that affidavit that he has reviewed much of the evidence, not all of it, but much of the evidence, including all the videotapes, and he has summarized all of it in this affidavit. The purpose of the affidavit is to back up a criminal complaint. The criminal complaint must be filed within 48 hours of suspect number 2's arrest. This is not the complaint on which he will be tried.
because the next document will be, or eventually there will be, an indictment from a grand jury. This is sufficient to keep him in jail until the grand jury can meet and decide what it will indict him for. That indictment, because this complaint is just a half a page long, Shep. The grand jury indictment will probably be very, very long and be filled with details, and will charge him with more than just the 2 crimes for which this charges him.
We could have anticipated these questions over whether he should be held as an enemy combatant or whatever. They come up every time.
Yes, they do. Now, there's 2 aspects to enemy combatant. One is trying a person as an enemy combatant before a military tribunal in Guantanamo Bay. That is not legally possible in this case because he is an American citizen and was an American citizen at the time these events took place. The other enemy combatant designation is one that would put him in the custody of the military for 30 days, during which he could not communicate to anyone, and during which the military and others in aid of the military could interrogate him relentlessly for 30 days. In order for that to happen, there would have to be unambiguous evidence of his being affiliated with a foreign group like Al-Qaeda that is waging war on us. According to the governor of Massachusetts, the mayor of Boston, their chief police people, and the head FBI agent in Boston, there is no such evidence. So that's probably why they're not going to go that route.
One more thing, the matter of reading him his Miranda rights. You have a right to remain silent. There's an exception put into place in 1984. And the intent of that exception was, what if somebody had placed some bombs, for instance, placed some bombs out there, they brought him into custody, but there are more bombs that are about to go off. You need to be able to compel them to speak right now while waiting to read them their Miranda rights. That's an ambiguous thing. How long that period of time is. Do you have a sense now that that period of time, whatever it is, has passed and that it's time for us to do with the Constitution?
Well, the theory behind this exception is that the public is at risk. And the public is so much at risk that the potential defendant's constitutional liberties must be negated. But that doesn't make sense with, again, what those same people that I just ticked off said. The governor, the mayor, the state police head, and the police commissioner in Boston, and the head of the FBI. They all said on Friday night, Boston's back to normal. The public is no longer at risk. So they can't have it both ways. They can't
they're trying to.
They can't claim that Boston is back to normal and the public is at risk on one hand and say, well, the public is not at risk and we have to interrogate this guy on the other. The purpose of the exception to the Miranda rule is to protect police officers and those around the defendant at the time he's arrested. Is that gun empty? Where's the other gun? Where's the other bomb? The type of excited utterance one would normally utter at the moment of an arrest. It is not to find a way around the Miranda ruling. The Miranda ruling requires all government agencies, from a traffic cop to the FBI, to tell you before they ask you a question that you don't have to answer it. The Obama administration has taken a radical approach to the Miranda rule by coming out of nowhere with this 48-hour rule that doesn't exist in any statute, and no court has ever permitted it.
Going to regret it?
I think they will regret it, because once they start using it, there'll be no stop to it.
Judge, thank you.
You're welcome, Shep.
1 week after the deadly bombings in Boston, the surviving suspect, Dzhokhar Zarniov, was charged with federal prosecutors in his hospital room. He was also read his Miranda rights. Well, here to explain the charges, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano.
Good morning.
Good morning. There's so much to get to here. So he was finally read his Miranda rights. You have to do that within 48 hours?
Well, theoretically, the Miranda rights should be read immediately as soon as the person's in custody, before you ask him any questions. The government, we don't know exactly what has happened. Eventually, we'll find out. But the government has told us it did not read him his Miranda rights, that it interrogated him for intelligence, not for law enforcement purposes. This is highly controversial, and it could affect the government's case. But at some point in that interrogation, which only lasted a few hours, and which apparently consisted of him writing answers because he can't speak due to the injury to his throat, at some point in that interrogation, the agents, the professional interrogators, decided we're not going to get anywhere, or we've already learned everything we can learn from him. They also have on their shoulder, breathing down their neck, so to speak, the Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure, which requires that he be charged with something within 48 hours. Otherwise, the unspeakable happens. They have to let him go. So they did charge him with this complaint.
filed by an FBI agent who basically wrote a 10-page affidavit summarizing the evidence that they have against them. This FBI agent personally viewed the tapes, looked at the evidence, and summarized it for a federal
And I've seen
judge.
that complaint. So basically, he's charged with having a weapon of mass destruction and killing people. But there was so much controversy in the last couple of days about whether or not he should be an enemy combatant.
Okay.
Senator Lindsey Graham definitely wanted that to gather intelligence. Where do you fall?
There are two aspects to enemy combatant. One is to try him as an enemy combatant before a military tribunal in Guantanamo Bay. He doesn't qualify for that because the statute expressly prohibits American citizens from being tried before military tribunals. The second is to incarcerate him in a military facility where he could be interrogated for up to 30 days without a lawyer present. But that statute requires that he be connected with a foreign organization waging war in the United States. There's only two of them right now, and that would be the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And the governor of Massachusetts, the head of the state police, the mayor of Boston, the police commissioner, and the head of the FBI in Boston all said he has no foreign
But
connections.
how do we know that yet?
Well, we don't know it, but without knowing it, there wouldn't be a basis to characterize him as an enemy combatant. The government can't just willy-nilly do that and hope that the evidence comes down their side. They could unravel their case by doing that.
And so now he could face the death penalty.
Oh, I think he will face the death penalty, although it requires a lot of procedures and committees to go through in the Justice Department. It's ultimately Attorney General Holder's decision. That'll take about 30 days. These will not be the final charges. The final charges will come from a grand jury in Boston. The trial will not be in Boston, but the grand jury will sit there.
All right. So much to discuss. We'll do it on another day.
We have a lot here.
Judge, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Joining me now, Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's our Fox News senior judicial analyst. So we in the news business get paid to be skeptical.
Right.
And what we have there is a lawyer for the woman who was married to the dead bombing suspect saying she knew nothing about it.
Right.
And the other lawyer came out yesterday and said she worked 70 to 80 hours a week over the past few weeks as a home health care aide and never was home and never saw the husband who was taking care of their toddler daughter.
Right.
And that conveniently puts her outside the home while the bombs were being made and the plans were coming together. And ultimately, the terrorist attack was carried out. Now, that could all be true, but it might not be as well. How do we get to the bottom of it?
Well, the only way the government can get to the bottom of it, if they want to get to the bottom of it from her, and she doesn't want to speak with them, is to subpoena her before a grand jury. Now, that is very awkward because they will be asking her questions under oath in front of a grand jury, and they will not have a roadmap of knowing what her answers are going to be. She'll have no alternative but to answer before the grand jury unless the answer would potentially implicate her, in which case she'll invoke the Fifth Amendment. She, of course, can only invoke the Fifth Amendment for herself, not for her husband, who, of course, is dead, and not for anybody else who may be living.
But does she still have spousal privilege in the wake of his death? I mean, normally you can't compel a wife to testify against her husband when on incriminating evidence. She's not required to turn it over.
She has no spousal privilege because he's deceased. If he were alive, she could invoke the spousal privilege. The government would try and get the court to invade the privilege, meaning force her to tell marital secrets. But with one spouse dead, the surviving spouse no longer enjoys that privilege.
The reports now are that she is cooperating. That's from her lawyer. Again, we take it with a grain of salt, but her lawyer now says that she is fully cooperating. And originally, the reports were that the FBI went to her house on Sunday night. She declined to speak with them. She lawyered up. And now, here we are on Tuesday, and she reportedly is speaking with the lawyers present. I mean, the lawyer probably accurately deduces that she herself could face charges here, depending on what her role was.
Well, she could, depending upon what she knew, when she knew it, and what she did about what she knew. I mean, for example, just a hypothetical.
Yeah.
If she knew he was one of the bombers and she harbored him, she's facing very, very serious charges as an accomplice or an accessory after the fact, depending upon whether she's charged in the federal or the state system.
Because they were living together. I mean, they were.
Yes.
There had been reports that they were separated, but now, according to the latest information, they were living together. She was working a lot, but they were living together with their daughter.
You know, sometimes you may agree with me from your own practicing years, and I will tell you this from mine. The presence of a lawyer when the government is interviewing the lawyer's client actually makes the interview a little better, because the lawyer will sometimes say, you can answer that, you can answer that, you can answer that, as opposed to the person on their own clamming up, I don't want to have anything to do with the government.
You can't read anything into the fact that she lawyered up. I mean,
no,
she
entitled.
probably accurately deduced that she was in a little bit of trouble potentially and needed representation.
She needs a lawyer whether she is a potential target for criminal prosecution or not, just because the FBI came knocking on her door.
But she could be a wealth of information. I got to go, but I want to ask you this. They say she's very distraught, that she cries a lot, that there are some reports out there that he had been calling her a wife, her a slut and a prostitute, and he, of course, was accused of domestic violence with another girlfriend prior to this woman. So if she turns on him, because they said she had been sort of turned, she became a Muslim under his direction, started wearing the hijab. If she can tell a tale of sort of, brainwashing, and now she could be extracted from it, she could be a wealth of information for the feds.
She could, for their prosecution against her brother-in-law, since obviously the husband is dead. But her lawyer has to weave a very, very fine line between what she knows and can use to help them and how that information could be used against her. So her lawyer has to interview her extensively, deeply, and profoundly in order to ascertain if there's anything in her brain or her behavior that could harm her. And that, of course, she would have to protect, as is the job of the lawyer.
Wow.
Frustrating to the feds, but they know how to address this.
It's such an interesting story because she and he went to live with her mother-in-law. That's Tamerlane's mother, who was the first one who they said sort of started to pull him over into a more devout form of Islam. And the mother says she had no idea. Then that crossed over into radical Islam. And
her father is this superstar Yale graduate physician in New England, very much in demand. There's a lot more going to come out.
Wow. All right. We'll see whether Katie Russell has something interesting to say to the feds. Judge, thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, now we know cameras, a lot of cameras, got them. Get ready for lots more of them. Not bad guys, we hope, but lots more cameras, and probably soon. New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly already urging hundreds, if not thousands more, on every street corner and passageway in and out of New York City. But he isn't stopping there. But my friend Judge Napolitano is saying, well, why don't you just stop right there? Judge, you're worried where all this leads, right?
Well, I'm worried that this could lead to the environment of East Germany, where, as you may recall, in its last years, it became a crime for failure to report a crime. And in fact, that prosecution, failure to report a crime, was the most frequently prosecuted crime. So if you're caught on camera looking the other way when someone engages in a misdeed, you could be prosecuted for looking the other way. And I don't think anybody wants that kind of society here. I also worry that the destruction of privacy in public, and let's face it, it's been virtually destroyed. Ray Kelly's heart is in the right place. He's the greatest police commissioner this city has had. He may be the best in the country right now. He's a lawyer. He understands the Constitution. But if we have cameras more than we have now, so that everywhere we go, the government can watch us, that will stifle the type of breathing room that freedom of expression requires in this country.
But does it affect you when you walk down the street? Like, I see them everywhere out here. They're on every street corner.
I'll tell you when.
I've almost gotten used to it.
I'll tell you when it will start affecting you. When two things happen. When they turn the microphones on. Most of these cameras are equipped with microphones so that the police can listen as well as watch. And when they say, Cavuto, don't go out into the street yet, there's a car coming. Or, more likely for you, Cavuto, put away that Twinkie, you shouldn't be eating
Or, Cavuto, go out in the street, we want to see what happens. So,
when that happens...
But if you're a good guy, you shouldn't have to worry. If you're a bad guy...
Yes, you should have to worry. Who wants the government telling us what to do? Well, that's not America. That's not the America we fought for. And if the cameras ever get beyond that and into our private homes, then the totalitarian state will be here.
All right, but it's a fine line, right? It's a fine line I addressed with Senator Rand Paul on Fox Business. I want you to react to this because I know you have been talking about this. Rand Paul on the subject.
We shouldn't be willy-nilly looking into everyone's backyard and what they're doing. But if there's a killer on the loose in a neighborhood, I'm not against drones being used to search them out, heat-seeking devices being used. I'm all for law enforcement. I'm just not for surveillance when there's not probable cause that a crime's being committed.
But he extended that to someone robbing a liquor store for $50.
He did. If he had said, as I think he intended to, and as I told you before the break, he called me to tell me about this. I spoke with him earlier this morning. If he had said someone's coming out of a liquor store with a gun and shooting it, well, then that person is fair game for anyone at whom he's shooting. The police obviously can use deadly force when deadly force is
But does that include
used.
the use of the drone?
In the senator's view, his filibuster was against using drones for targeted assassinations. In the senator's view, he has no problem with the police using technology to fight crime. In my view, I don't want 30,000 drones flying in my face. Where did I get that number? The Air Force says in fewer than 10 years, there will be 30,000 drones, some the size of mosquitoes, flying in the country. That's also not America. Cameras on every street corner and drones every time you sneeze.
Judge, we're doing all of this to keep you safe or safer. You have nothing to worry about. Hey, you're a judge. You're an upstanding human being, an uprighteous one as well. Don't worry. We're going after, and this is meant to target the people who do something nefarious.
When the government is in your face, you can't be free. No matter how benign or well-intended the government may be, it's just human nature. Could you imagine Jefferson with the thought of cameras watching him everywhere he went, or a drone in his face?
Well, especially knowing his personal habits, that would be a problem.
I picked him intentionally.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Judge, very, very much.
Pleasure.
New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg says he knows people are worried about privacy, but when you're facing terror, too bad.
Our laws and our interpretation of the Constitution, I think, have to change.
So do we have to give up our constitutional freedoms to stay safe?
Let's ask Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, you agree with Bloomberg, right?
Oh gosh, you know I'm chuckling because you and I did this every day when we had Brian and the judge. No, the mayor is profoundly wrong. The whole essence of humanity and the reason America is a great place is because the government respects human freedom. It's the job of the government to keep us free and safe. If it keeps us safe but not free, it's not doing its job. And that goes for him. It goes for the President of the United States. It goes for the mayor of Boston.
So what he's talking about, I think, is increasing surveillance cameras, and you believe that that is, an imposition on personal freedoms because you think it's a slippery slope.
I do. If it were up to Mayor Bloomberg, surveillance cameras, and I'm suggesting this, I haven't heard him say it, would be inside as well as outside. A very famous radio voice agrees with me on this.
You mean Rush Limbaugh? Let's listen.
And by the way, when you trade your freedom for temporary security, when you're not in charge of your security, when you have no control over your security, when you have no control over your economic circumstances, what kind of a thin thread are you hanging by? You're depending on the performance of other people that don't even know you. Politicians in a distant capital who on a whim could cancel whatever program that you depend on.
That is so profound, it could have been uttered at the time of the American Revolution. The debate between liberty and security is the essence of America. The default position is liberty. That's why we're a great place.
The big concern is people using our freedom to use it for dastardly reasons that end up killing us.
I understand that. And the problem is when the government takes freedom away from decent people like us, these monsters don't care if they're on camera. They knew the cameras were there and they did it anyway.
You know what? If there are cameras everywhere, just don't ever be naked. I mean, that's my philosophy.
Smile for the camera.
That is the thesis of this segment.
Only you could end this by saying
Suddenly I feel bad I'm clothed. Judge, great to see you.
Have a great day, guys. Brian, keep your clothes on.
For now.
The FBI was questioning the surviving suspect, and a judge and attorneys apparently showed up at the hospital to Mirandize him, and that stopped the questioning immediately. The feds claim that put our national security at risk. Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior analyst with me now, a former judge himself. Judge, good morning to you.
Good morning, Bill.
In this matter, did this judge interfere with an ongoing case?
No, absolutely not, Bill. The judge followed standard criminal procedure. Look, the FBI filed the criminal complaint against this guy. That started in motion a series of events with which the FBI is intimately familiar. Once they file the criminal complaint, he becomes a defendant. A defendant in federal court must be brought immediately before a judge. If he's at large, they arrest him. If he's already in FBI custody, they bring him to the judge. If they can't bring him to the judge, they bring the judge to him. The law requires this immediate or as soon as is possible first appearance. And the first order of business, Bill, at the defendant's first appearance is the Miranda warnings. So if the FBI did not want him to have Miranda warnings, whether you think that's good or bad is a value judgment. They should not have filed the criminal complaint against him when they did. But by filing the criminal complaint, they invoked the federal rules of criminal procedure, which inevitably result in the presence of the defendant and the judge in the same room and the judge administering the Miranda warnings.
So to be specific now, two direct questions on this. So don't file the criminal complaint and you can do what you want?
No. If they don't file the criminal complaint within a certain period of time, they have to let them go. I mean, they're caught in a catch-22. You arrest someone, you have to file a criminal complaint in order to justify keeping them. But once you file that criminal complaint, you
have to bring them before a judge to have their rights read.
There's this public safety exception, right, for the Miranda rule that was started in 1984. I think the administration picked it up again and reinforced it in 2011, I do believe.
The administration,
which would allow the FBI to question this guy for perhaps even a longer period of time.
Let me tell you what the public safety exception says. The Supreme Court has one opinion on it. It lasts for 10 seconds. It lasts for the time of the arrest, so the arresting officers are not jeopardized, and they can say, without giving a Miranda warning, where's the gun? Is anybody else with you? Eric Holder, on his own, expanded that 10 seconds to 48 hours. One FBI agent filed the criminal complaint in Boston while the other FBI agents were interrogating him in the hospital room. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing.
Well, but based on what we know, I need a quick answer here, too. There was some level of cooperation on behalf of this 19-year-old.
Apparently, yes.
Is that testimony in jeopardy or not?
That testimony, if unmirandized, can only be used for intelligence purposes. It cannot be used in the case against him.
Which goes to the public safety exception. Judge, thank you. And Napolitano.
You're welcome.
Well, as Catherine Herridge noted earlier, U.S. officials reportedly say the surviving suspect told the FBI about the bombings during 16 hours of questioning before he was advised of his constitutional rights to remain silent and then he could have an attorney. Then those officials say a judge arrived at the suspect's hotel room with a representative from the United States Attorney's Office, the hospital room, I don't know what I said there, but I meant hospital room, and advised the suspect of his rights. Then he stopped talking. That's the story. Let's take this to the judge. Fox News chief judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. First of all, I want to get the facts out of the way here because I think they're important. The reading of the rights does not activate them. The absence of the reading does not remove them. They simply are. They are rights. And he, like you and I, has the right to remain silent. What's confusing about this?
Nothing. Nothing. The way you said it could not have been said more accurately.
Those are just the facts.
Or more eloquently. So here's what happened. He is being interrogated in a hospital room by, we don't know how many, FBI agents and probably some intelligence agents. The time is ticking. He's been in custody 72 hours. The law says you have to keep, in order to keep him, you got to file a criminal complaint with a federal judge to justify keeping him beyond that time period.
Otherwise, it's
kidnapping. If you don't file the complaint, then you have no right to hold the body, no matter what you say the evidence is. So at the same time the interrogation is going on, another team of FBI agents, very prudently in downtown Boston, are reviewing the evidence and preparing an affidavit for a federal judge. Here's the evidence. Here's the evidence we would introduce in court. Here's the crime we believe he committed. We're going to file a charge against him for using a weapon of mass destruction, for committing murder, and for destroying property, and for maiming people. And that's filed. Once that's filed, that starts another clock ticking. And that clock is under the federal rules of criminal procedure. When you file a complaint against someone, if they're out there, you go arrest them, you bring them before a judge. If they're already in your custody, you bring them before a judge. If you can't get them before a judge because of their physical condition, you get the judge to them. This is not rocket science, Shep. This is Criminal Procedure 101. It happens in every courthouse, state, local, and federal, every day in the United States of America.
What is the ruckus? It's as if people think because they didn't read him his rights, he did not have them. He had them.
Correct.
What they're suggesting is that we shouldn't have told him what his rights are.
Ah, that's where they are wrong, because the Supreme Court recognized in the Miranda case, most people don't know they have the right to remain silent, especially in the face of a half-dozen government agents shouting at you and demanding that you answer. In order to correct that most people don't know, the Supreme Court directed that whenever anyone is in the custody of the government, any American government, local, state, or federal, the custodian of the human being must tell that human being, I'm going to ask you questions and I want you to answer, but you have the right to remain silent. You don't have to answer. When a defendant, and he turns from suspect to defendant at the moment the criminal complaint is filed, when a defendant is brought before a judge for the first appearance, whether it's in a hospital room or a courtroom, as is traditionally the case, the first order of business for the judge to make sure that person did receive the Miranda rights. So the judge re-gives the Miranda warnings, even if they had already been given. There is nothing new about this. There's nothing remarkable about this. Now, I need to address this so-called public safety exception. The public safety exception to the Miranda warning does not last for 48 hours. That seems to have come from somewhere in the Justice Department and perhaps somewhere in the media. I don't know.
That someone says it, just says it, that it comes out of someone's mouth does not make it true.
Correct. The public safety exception exists for a very short duration during the process of the arrest. You arrest someone and they have a holster without a gun. And so you say to them, where's the gun? You can ask that. The police can ask that to preserve them, to protect themselves and others at the scene of the arrest without giving the Miranda warnings. But once that person is secured in police custody and doesn't have a weapon in his hands, the obligation to administer the Miranda warning arises immediately. Not 48 hours later, but immediately. That's the law everywhere in the United States.
I'm out of time and have been for a while, but I wonder how concerned you are that when these big and troubling events happen that bring us together as a nation and we mourn in unison, that we will go to the extremes of the Constitution and sometimes beyond it.
I am profoundly concerned that when the evidence of guilt is overwhelming and the people are weeping because they have been deeply disturbed and hurt and harmed and maimed and killed, the government will find ways to go around the Constitution. And when the government has done that historically, it has never worked, it has never brought about safety, it has only lessened freedom.
The conservative columnist George Will with a fascinating column in the Washington Post this morning. It's at WashingtonPost.com, and I think worth a read.
It's a great story about a similar event in World War II and how it backfired on the government.
Good to see you, Judge.
Thank you, Shep.
You have the rights, you know.
Yes, thank you.
I'm not going to read them, but
man, you stated it perfectly.
You already have.
Okay, now we are going to talk about that topic we mentioned a moment ago with the authorities scouring through surveillance video and the like up in Boston after the bombings. It has reopened the debate, privacy versus safety.
And here to debate that, Judge Andrew Napolitano, a Fox News senior judicial analyst, joining us. Judge, good to see you.
Good morning, guys.
Do we need to worry about encroachment on our privacy as they, just as an aftermath of these bombings in Boston?
Yes, we do. We do, because there's a natural inclination on the part of all people when they are afraid to reach for safety rather than liberty. And there's a natural inclination on the part of the government to do something, almost anything, to give the impression, real or illusory, that it is keeping us safe. And in both of those inclinations, it is liberty that is sacrificed. And often, I know this sounds like a cliche, but it is true, and it is a cliche, liberty once sacrificed rarely comes back. I mean, think of the things that we thought were radical and that we gave up at the time of 9/11. Federal agents can write their own search warrants. Well, we hadn't had that since the British soldiers could write their own search warrants before the Revolution. We wrote the Fourth Amendment so that wouldn't happen. That's now commonplace, and hundreds of thousands of these are written every year. So the government will reach for more power because it wants its job to be easier. It also wants people to be placated. The government is doing something. And people will let the government do it because they want to feel safe. But they will forget that when the reason for the desire for safety passes, when the better times come, we will have less freedom if we aren't careful.
Let me ask you a modern day question. In the year where we are right now, in 2013, where is the legal line, to the best that you could describe it, drawn on some of these key issues that people bring up? So tapping the phones certainly would be
How about just surveillance cameras in the streets?
Surveillance cameras in the streets, you're right.
Well,
that's another
surveillance
big one.
cameras in the streets pre-9/11 were really unheard of. Now they're extremely commonplace. I live in a very, very small rural town in northwest New Jersey, and that town is filled with surveillance cameras. And I once complained to the police chief, who's a good friend of mine, Mike, what are you turning this town into East Germany for? And he said to me, Judge, don't worry about it. We're just watching. We're not listening. I said, what do you mean listening? He said, well, these cameras also have microphones in them, but we agreed not to activate the microphones. Now, we laugh at this, but
I'm laughing because you should have told
when
you
you're walking down the street with your significant other or with anyone, do you really expect the police to be listening to you? This will profoundly change the way we live our lives.
So what's legal or illegal?
A thing under observation changes on account of its being under observation. That's a Heisenberg's law of physics. This obviously happens to human beings. The law is in public. There is no expectation of privacy. So what we're looking at now, which is not very far from here, the microphones and the cameras are lawful. But the law still is, if the police want to know what's in here, they would have to go to a judge with probable cause about me or about the owner of this, not he was in an area where he may have taken a picture of a bad guy and we need to know if he has the picture. But what crime have I committed? Probable cause of crime
to justify a search warrant to extract this from me against my will. That is still the law of the land. The question is, will the courts and the police respect the law of the land, or will they be so terrified of terrorists that they'll disobey the law of the land? And then they, and not the terrorists, will be taking away our freedoms.
Do we, because we've given up so much of our freedom in terms of how we behave with electronic devices and what we reveal to the world, whether it's on Facebook, other forms of social media, basically, should the government have the right to look into that information in our private lives? Should we give the government greater leeway because the world has changed that way?
I don't think we should. Here's an example. Would it be easier if the police could break down any door they wanted and arrest whoever they wanted and didn't need a search warrant? It would be easier for them, but who would want to live in such a society? In East Germany, it was a crime to fail to report another crime. So if your observation of a crime was on tape, not only would the crime be prosecuted, you'd be prosecuted for failure to report it. Do we really want to live that? Do we really want that big brother society to come here? If we do, we will never know freedom. If we don't, there will always be risks. There are always risks that monsters will be among us, but in return for the risk is personal liberty in a free society.
All right. Thank you, Judge.
Pleasure.
Good to see you, Judge Napolitano.
Okay, U-Haul rank.
Will employers soon be able to ask you for your social media password as a last-minute attempt to block such a request was killed out of the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act?
Let's bring the judge in. Fox News senior judicial analyst Andrew Napolitano is with us here. And how about it, Judge? Give me your password.
You don't know what you'll find behind it, Connell. This is legislation which is monstrous in scope.
Yeah.
It basically provides for the computer servers that we all use and the government to share information, ostensibly to ward off cyber attacks. During the process of the negotiation and amendment and creation of the legislation, a member of Congress proposed an amendment to it which would have barred employers from asking for passwords of employees, and that amendment failed. That doesn't mean if this legislation becomes law that employers will ask you for it. It only means that in states where it is not otherwise prohibited, it is prohibited here in New York, it's prohibited in New Jersey, it's prohibited in California by state law, where it is not otherwise prohibited, that employers will be free to ask for it. But the larger picture here is this bizarre, unique partnership between the government and computer servers, ostensibly to ward off cyber attacks. The government says that by sharing its codes and algorithms with the computer servers, it can help them ward off cyber attacks. Computer servers know that whatever they get from the government, they're going to have to give back in kind. What will they give back in kind? Their codes, their algorithms, and our emails and our email addresses, and what you devoutly wish to have are passwords. Do we really want the government to have all of that? Or are there other ways to ward off cyber attack without giving this information to the government? And does the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, permit the government to get this private information about us? Is there no longer a right to privacy because there's still a Fourth Amendment? How's that for a mouthful?
That's no, but there's a lot to digest, and you mentioned that there are state efforts to block companies from monitoring people's personal Facebook and Twitter accounts.
Right.
But now you have some Wall Street firms that are looking for exemptions to those laws because they say, well, we need to monitor our employees' activities because it relates to stock manipulation. What are they telling us?
Yes. Wall Street's concern is a legitimate one. Because if the person is high-ranking enough in a Wall Street company and they are involved in stock manipulation or insider trading, that could impose liability on the Wall Street firm as well as liability on the individual.
So because it's a private business, a completely different situation.
Yes.
What it is.
Yes. If a News Corp can ask us for information that the federal government can't, that the state of New York can't, because the Constitution restrains the federal government and it restrains the state of New York. It does not restrain News Corp in the same respect.
You want to talk about cameras in the street, access to our online accounts. Have we lost all expectation of privacy in this country, except if we're at home in a closet with the shades pulled down?
Well, you know, when people are afraid, and we all were afraid a week ago now,
when those monsters were running around Boston and nobody knew who had caused that massacre, people tend towards safety rather than liberty. And there is this myth that most people accept. By sacrificing privacy, we will somehow be safer. How do we know it's a myth? Just look at what happened in Boston. All those cameras and all that street, all those streets, all the microphones and all the cameras, and it didn't stop these crazies from doing what they did. It helped the police find them, but it didn't stop the carnage. But I think it is human nature, when afraid, to prefer safety over freedom. It's an unfortunate answer to your question. Yes, privacy is diminishing, which is why Geraldo referred to me yesterday as a minority of one by defending all these privacy rights.
Right.
He means two, because he's on this side.
Geraldo.
And with you guys, it would be four.
Love Geraldo.
Thank you.
And you.
All right, I've got to move on. I've got to move on. The president has just issued a statement about the late Margaret Thatcher. He said she was a great champion of freedom and liberty. America has lost a true friend. Now, I think you agree with my characterization of Margaret Thatcher. What do you say to the president?
He can't possibly mean economic freedom and economic liberty, because she liberated Great Britain from the chains of socialism through the sheer force of her will and her ability to keep the Conservative Party together and with its eye on the ball of personal freedom, not just civil liberties, but economic liberties.
Precisely.
She also, along with Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, won the Cold War and destroyed communism without firing a shot.
Remarkable.
Absolutely remarkable,
And we've turned full
transformational figure in the history of freedom in the modern era.
And we turn full circle. All right, Judge, I'm glad we agree
on that.
We do agree, young man.
Could not agree more. Now, in David Stockman's book.
Oh, yeah.
Back to that.
All right, everybody, out of time. Should the government treat the Boston bombing suspect as an enemy combatant? The mayor said, yes, we should. Now let's hear from Judge Andrew Napolitano.
So, am I Larry Holmes following? Muhammad Ali on this one. Thank you, Charles.
So?
Look, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is very, very dangerous times that we enter if we start talking about suspending constitutional liberties because of the gravity of the harm and the obviousness of the guilt. This person is entitled to the full panoply of constitutional protections, no matter what he's done, and no matter who he's harmed, and no matter how many people he's aroused. I'll make Senator Lindsey Graham and Mayor Giuliani's argument. And about Giuliani, let me say this. He's not just the former mayor of New York. He's the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York and a serious student of the law, unlike a lot of public officials today. Their argument is, suppose this guy was trained by a foreign government or by a foreign entity, took his uniform off and came here and was their agent, and actually did this as the agent of a foreign entity, Al-Qaeda, or a foreign country that wished to bring down American society. What's the difference if he did that in uniform or out? If he did it in uniform, he'd be in Guantanamo Bay. That's their argument. Except that the governor of Massachusetts, the state police chief of Massachusetts, the commissioner of police of the city of Boston, and the mayor.
Senator Rand Paul made headlines earlier this year for his 13-hour filibuster opposing the use of drones in America on Americans. He opposed it. But the senator, maybe he's changed his mind. Here is Rand Paul talking about drones with Neil Cavuto, taped Monday, shown last night.
If someone comes out of a liquor store with a weapon and $50 in cash, I don't care if a drone kills him or a policeman kills him.
Now, is that a reversal? Judge Andrew Napolitano is here. He's got a lot to add to this story. He's got an exclusive because you, this morning, talked to Senator Paul.
This morning, Senator Paul called me. He called me because he was concerned about the misunderstanding which generated, almost exploded overnight on the blogs and the websites. The tape that Neil did of him on Tuesday was aired sometime in the 8 o'clock hour last night. By midnight, the stuff was all over the place, and even people who are staunch supporters of his and his father's and whose values I share were concerned that he changed his mind on drones. And the answer is an unequivocal no. The filibuster was about the concept of targeted assassinations, about the president picking and choosing who to kill in the U.S. or elsewhere who had not received due process of law. They had not been charged with a crime. They had not been convicted of a crime. They just got in the president's crosshairs. That was the essence of the filibuster.
Got it.
However, yesterday when he used the clip that you just ran and said, coming out of a liquor store with a gun and $50. He probably should have said coming out of a liquor store shooting a gun and with $50, because clearly if someone is using a deadly weapon on the police or on civilians, the police can use a deadly weapon with which to repel that person, whether the weapon comes from a sidearm that the police are holding or from some high-tech means. The senator's concern has been killing without due process. He's never been against technology. Having said all that, there is a real fundamental value issue here. Do we want drones all over the place? Because some of them are going to be the size of mosquitoes. My view is you need a warrant for that, because without a warrant, the police will use drones to look at you in your bedroom or your hot tub. And without a warrant, because it's easier for them to do so, to gather information about you.
Wasn't there, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but wasn't there a question about whether or not you needed a warrant if you're flying in a helicopter and you're looking for marijuana? You're looking into private property, checking for marijuana growers.
The answer to that is a little subtle. For marijuana, yes, you do need a warrant. If you are the government and you're looking for marijuana on the Varney estates, just using this hypothetically, the government would need a search warrant before it could do it. But if on the Varney estates was a business that the government regularly regulated, it would not need a search warrant in order to observe that business.
Okay, now wait a second. We're not talking, when we're talking about a guy coming out of a liquor store shooting a gun, he's got $50 in his hand. He's droned. That's different. You don't need a search warrant. What you need is some kind of authority to shoot him with the drone.
Well, if he's shooting at the police, you don't need any additional authority. If he's shooting at you and you have a weapon, you can shoot back. If he's shooting at a cop, the cop can shoot back. The question is, do we want society filled with flying pieces of plastic that can watch us and that can kill? That's a value. That's a value judgment.
And it's going to happen.
Will only happen if the government permits it, because right now these things are not licensable in the United States.
I think the argument over gun control should be expanded to drone control. Because, you know, we're not far off the day when I could buy a drone, arm it, and shoot somebody.
Correct. Here's the issue. If the government derives its power from the consent of the governed, not from a monarch, but from the consent of the governed. And if the governed do not have the authority to own drones, then how can the government have the authority to own drones? Stated differently, private individuals are going to have drones to shoot down the government drones in their backyards. Do we really want a society in which that happens? That's why I would argue one step beyond the senator and say, we need more than just a consensus on drones. We need a judicial authorization that the Constitution puts the government in your face with a piece of plastic. In my view, it doesn't.
We've run over time, but Judge, it was good. Thank you very much indeed, sir.